It is more than fair to say that MotoGP has had its fair share of controversies over the course of its 75-year history. With well over 1,000 Grand Prix having been run to date, it's understandable that a certain number of those have had dubious, weird, interesting, and downright controversial circumstances surrounding their events and results. Today, I want to take a look at a number of these events, and I want to break them down for you in a little bit of detail. If you're unfamiliar with an iceberg, it's a way of organizing items or events, with the most popular and well-known things in a category being at the top, and the darker, less well-known, and more obscure entries being at the bottom. I'll break down what happened and what the outcomes were, so that you might get to know a little more about MotoGP history. Or just hear the stories one more time. Just a few disclaimers before we get started. The first one, this is going to be a long video. If you're driving to work, have a long commute, or need something to go to sleep to, this might be your cup of tea. Now, for this list, I won't be talking about any rider fatalities until we get down to tier 6, as some people may not want that out of this video. I will warn you before that happens, but just so you're aware, that's why you may not see some things which you might think deserve to be higher on the list. The research for this video, the filming, the writing, and the editing took me a while. I would really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe if you enjoy, as it really helps me decide which direction to take my channel. Finally, I will not be able to cover all these races in excruciating detail. Some of these races have had books, videos, and even movies made about them. I will not be able to cover every single detail of every single event. I'm here to just give a rough breakdown of what happened. Let me know which Grand Prix I missed in the comments below, and maybe I'll make a follow-up to this video one day. Now, let's get started on our trip down the controversial motorcycle Grand Prix iceberg. The 2015 Malaysian Grand Prix. To start off, we have perhaps the most controversial race in MotoGP history. This is the moment that irreparably damaged the relationship between two of the sport's biggest modern stars, Marc Marquez and Valentino Rossi. The events that led up to this and the fallout from both fans' perspectives and the riders' perspectives are far too great for me to cover in just this short segment. For this, I highly recommend the video by Intern Talks Wheel. It's a very good breakdown in about 25 minutes of exactly what happened before, during, and after the events of this race, but I will try to summarize. Heading into the race, the 2015 season had already been marred with controversy between these two riders. Earlier in the season, a risky pass from Rossi had left Marquez on the ground in Argentina, and in Assen, a last corner battle resulted in Marquez pushing Rossi off the track, causing him to skip the chicane and rejoin the track in the lead. Rossi was not penalized for either of these events. Whether or not he deserved to be is somewhat irrelevant, as Marquez would still not have been in a position to take the championship due to a season full of retirements. These incidents, coupled with a close battle in an unforgettable Phillip Island race, would spark comments from Rossi ahead of the Malaysian Grand Prix. In the pre-race conference, Rossi would make the claim that Marquez was intentionally trying to help Rossi's teammate Jorge Lorenzo win the championship, an opinion which he holds to this day. Marquez would laugh these comments off in the press conference, but would later come out and say that he was shocked that Rossi made these comments so publicly, wishing that he'd brought his concerns up to him in private first. He said that he saw the move as being incredibly disrespectful and an attempted intimidation from the superstar. During the race, Lorenzo and Dani Pedrosa would race for first, while Rossi would be stuck fighting with Marquez for third place. He was clearly upset with this, hoping to attempt to catch the frontrunners. A series of aggressive moves from both riders would culminate in the incident. With 14 laps to go, Marquez would make a daring outside pass around Rossi in turn 13. Rossi would respond by deliberately running Marquez wide. At this point, there's clear movement from Rossi's left foot, and Marquez goes down, out of the race. Rossi would go on to finish third. After the race, Rossi claimed that while he had run Marquez off in an attempt to make him lose time, he alleged that Marquez's right handlebar had snagged his left foot, causing the movement seen in the race. Following this, race direction summoned both riders to review the incident. Rossi was given 3 penalty points, enough to force him to start the final round in Valencia from the back of the grid. The incident created a schism in the racing world. Many prominent figures in motorsport would vocally come out on one side or the other. Jorge Lorenzo, 2-time champion Casey Stoner, and World Superbike champion Carl Fogarty would all voice their displeasure with Rossi's penalty, claiming that any other rider would have been black flagged, and the doctor was only given a pass due to his legendary status. Other prominent figures such as Michael Laverty and Colin Edwards would come out in support of Rossi, claiming that Marquez should have respected that Rossi was fighting for a championship while he was not, and let him through to fight for the lead. Outside of MotoGP, other figures would weigh in as well. Formula One drivers weighed in. and the situation even had the prime ministers of each rider's respective nation voice their support for their fellow countrymen. This race also directly led to the formation of the MotoGP Stewards Panel, after Honda had threatened to publicly release data proving that Rossi had kicked Marquez's bike, prompting an emergency meeting between the FIM and the riders prior to the final round of the season. This incident ultimately led to a permanent divide being cast between the riders and their massive fan bases. Prior to this, it was common to see riders representing Rossi and Marquez at the same race. After this, not so much. This race still dominates MotoGP and motorsport discourse in general to this very day, being placed in the likes of 2021 Abu Dhabi and Formula One as some of the most controversial motorsport moments in the past decade. Whether you believe Marquez selfishly kept Rossi from winning his 10th world title as revenge for previous incidents, or you believe that Rossi was an old conspiracy theorist who took his grievances out on the young and up-and-coming superstar, one thing remains certain. The 2015 Malaysian Grand Prix still dominates MotoGP discourse to this day, and its ripple effects will surely be felt throughout the rest of MotoGP history. What do I think? Well,
if I speak, I am in big trouble.
2006 Estoril Grand Prix. The 2006 season saw the first threat to Rossi's dominant early 2000s run, the American rider Nicky Hayden. Hayden would engage in a close battle with Rossi throughout the season, and heading into the penultimate round of the season in Estoril, would be leading him by 12 points. This race would see Valentino Rossi, riding the best looking bike in MotoGP history, don't at me, take the lead early, followed by teammate Colin Edwards, then Hayden, who was followed by his own teammate, a rookie Dani Pedrosa. While Pedrosa would go on to be recognized as one of the best riders in the world, at this time he was just Hayden's young and up-and-coming teammate. Thus, it was understandable that Pedrosa was met with a considerable amount of venom from fans across the board when he took out his teammate with an attempted pass gone wrong on lap 4. It truly seemed like Pedrosa had just cost Hayden the championship, as Rossi would go on to finish second, giving him an 8-point advantage over Hayden going into the final race of the season. Hayden would later say that him and everyone in Honda felt sick. He felt as though it truly could have cost him the world championship, and while Pedrosa had come to his trailer to talk it out and shake hands afterwards, it wasn't something he could just brush off. In the final round of the year at Valencia, the stage looked set for Rossi to take home his 8th world championship, after he qualified on pole. But after a fall on lap 2, the marshals don't move that fast for everyone, folks, he would be too far back, and Hayden would come away with the championship. Still, the relationship between Pedrosa and Hayden would never fully recover, and Pedrosa would face scrutiny for his actions for many years. 2013, Phillip Island. With 3 rounds remaining in the MotoGP World Championship, Marc Marquez had the opportunity to make history, becoming just the 3rd rider, excluding Leslie Graham, to win the Premier Class Championship in his rookie season, and being the first to do so in over 35 years. Marquez held a commanding 43-point lead over Jorge Lorenzo heading into Phillip Island, and had the chance to secure the championship right then and there. However, his championship run would soon be overshadowed by some more drama at the track. The track at Phillip Island had recently been resurfaced ahead of this round, and during Saturday qualifying, the tire supplier Bridgestone became aware of the fact that their tires would not be able to hold up for full race distance. Unable to get a full batch of new tires to the track in time, Race Direction quickly came up with the idea to enforce a mandatory pit stop mid-race. The morning of the race, the distance was shortened from 26 to 19 laps, and riders were told they would be required to pit no later than the end of their 10th lap in order to ensure rider safety. Riders and teams were upset by this, but had to go ahead with the race anyway. What other choice did they have? The start of the race would see Dani Pedrosa, Marc Marquez, and Lorenzo scrapping for the lead. Come lap 9, Pedrosa would come into the pits, leaving Marquez and Lorenzo to fight for the lead. It has since been reported that what happened next was a result of miscommunication between members of Marquez's pit crew, with some believing that the order was for the 10th lap, and some believing Marquez was allowed to stay out 1 lap longer. Regardless, come the end of lap 10, Lorenzo would enter the pits, and Marquez would stay out 1 lap too many. Marquez would be black flagged shortly after, leaving him with no points from the race. Lorenzo would go on to win and cut the lead down to 18 points. Marquez would say that he was just following team orders and felt that an immediate disqualification was too harsh of a penalty for the offense, claiming he could have been given a time penalty or a ride-through instead. Luckily, this didn't end up having a bearing on the championship, as Marquez would go on to make history and win the championship as a rookie that year. However, if he hadn't, this would certainly be up there for one of the most controversial moments in motorsports history, the 2024 Aragon Grand Prix. While I was doing research for this video, the 2024 Aragon Grand Prix happened. I sat down to watch it and afterwards immediately started writing, because This one might deserve a place on the list. The issues at this race began on Friday, when riders took to the newly resurfaced track for the first time and found it to be very dirty. Lack of confidence in the front end on bikes was a huge problem, with Simon Crafar saying he had absolutely zero front feeling during his test laps on Thursday. Over the course of Friday's practice sessions, rubber buildup from the tires helped to mitigate this, so by the end of the day, the track was in good shape, and riders were not overwhelmingly concerned heading into Saturday morning. Unfortunately, severe thunderstorms would come overnight, and the rain would wash away all of the rubber, leaving more dirt on track than ever, most notably on the entire left side of the starting grid. This would contribute to world champion Pecco Bagnaia getting a lousy start, falling from third to the middle of the pack, and Aleix Espargaro would lock his front wheel, leading to a collision with Fabio Di Gianantonio, which took him out of the race. That evening in the safety commission meeting, many riders, Bagnaia chief among them, demanded that the track be cleaned properly ahead of the Grand Prix. Race Direction maintains that this was done, but once again overnight rain would thwart their efforts, and the track would look worse than ever on Sunday. Going off the racing line at all would mean a buildup of dirt on the tires and loss of traction. Bagnaia would suffer another mishap at the start, but this time he would start gaining positions instead of losing them. He would fight his way into 4th place, right behind Alex Marquez. Due to his mediocre finish in the sprint race the day prior, Bagnaia had lost the World Championship lead to Jorge Martin. If he could pass the younger Marquez brother here, he would only be 7 points behind Martin in the standings. With 6 laps to go, Bagnaia caught Marquez, who would go wide in turn 12 and would take the inside line going into 13 as a result. A much faster Pecco Bagnaia would sweep around the outside and, presumably thinking he was clear of Marquez, would attempt to close the line. This would prove to be a race-ending mistake. This would result in Marquez and Bagnaia's bikes becoming tangled and running off course, trapping Bagnaia under the bike and throwing Marquez off in a truly harrowing-looking crash. Both riders were miraculously okay, but Bagnaia's hope of mitigating damage to the World Championship run were out the window. In the days since the incident, fans and riders have been quick to place blame on one rider or the other, while fans of the Spaniard claim he was on the racing line, and Pecco made an unnecessarily risky move by closing the line from the outside, where Marquez may not have been able to see him. After the race, Bagnaia would say, quote, "It's impossible he didn't see me," end quote, and claim Alex Marquez made no attempt to slow down until they had already collided, according to Ducati's data, while Alex's brother Mark, upon seeing the video, would claim the exact opposite, saying it was impossible for Alex to see him because of his lean angle at the time, and Bagnaia caused the accident by closing the racing line. Sort of an interesting commentary from you, Mark. After the race, both riders would meet with Race Direction, and it would be deemed a racing incident. In the report, it appears as though the dirt on the track and fears of going off the racing line played a major part in riders' choices on the track, and as such, no punishment was handed out. Within the paddock, reactions are mixed as well. Fabio Quartararo and Miguel Oliveira seem pretty blunt with their opinion that it was Marquez to blame for the crash, while other riders such as Jack Miller, Aleix Espargaro, and Marc Marquez suggest Bagnaia should have taken into more consideration where the Spaniard was on the track. Joan Mir took the same stance as Race Direction, saying it was partially on both riders for being careless, and, in the end, it was just a racing incident. Now, if Bagnaia goes on to win the World Championship this year or lose by a wide margin, this will end up having been inconsequential. But if Bagnaia loses the championship by 16 points or less, this will surely be looked back at as the deciding moment, and perhaps the crash that caused the Italian rider his three-peat. 2011, Jerez. Valentino Rossi and Casey Stoner are two of the most skilled riders in history, and they were both at the peak of their powers in 2011. Both riders had shown animosity towards each other in the past, with Stoner being especially critical of Rossi's attempt to replace him on the Ducati. In Jerez, the two found themselves in a wet weather battle, and just 7 laps into the race, Rossi would attempt a daring pass in turn 1, and would lose the front end, taking Stoner out of the race. Rossi would remount his bike and finish 5th. After the race, he would come into Stoner's paddock to apologize, with all of his riding gear still on. Stoner found this to be a profoundly disrespectful display, later going on record saying, quote, "For me, when he returned to the box to apologize, and you're wearing the gloves, the helmet, I don't have a lot of respect for that. If he came to me and not publicly, then that would have been different. But I was disappointed to see the way he handled it." Stoner would famously tell Rossi,
"Obviously your ambition outweighed the talent."
When asked about the incident in 2021, Stoner claimed him and his team forgot about it, as they didn't consider Rossi to be a threat for the World Championship that year. However, both riders admitted to having flashbacks to the incident a year later when a similar moment happened in Le Mans. Sure enough, Stoner would go on to win the World Championship that year, and thankfully, the incident didn't have a bearing on the results. Into Tier 2, we come to the 1996 Spanish Grand Prix. Last corner passes and desperate final lunges make for some of the best racing in MotoGP history. However, the most unexpected and dramatic ending may have come in the 1996 Spanish Grand Prix. Alex Crivier was a one-time 125cc champion looking to take the throne from Mick Doohan, who was attempting a three-peat in the Premier class. Crivier would put on a defensive riding masterclass in his home race, taking the lead early and holding off Mick Doohan for more than 20 laps. The world champion was unable to find a way through. With just 2 laps to go, Spanish fans were ecstatic and began to rush the barriers. It was common for fans to rush the track back then, but not like what you're about to see. With just a few corners remaining in the race, Doohan seemed to be a little too far away to make a move. But as the 2 Honda riders came around the Iceberg curve, they were greeted with a shocking sight. The fans had rushed the track already, prior to the end of the race. Dozens of fans stood in the gravel and grass on either side of the track. Crivier sat up, taking some speed off to help prevent any harm to the fans. This move allowed Doohan to close in, sticking to Crivier's rear tire around the last few turns, until in the very last corner.
He's going to, here comes Mick Doohan, they're going to go to the final, oh, Crivier's gone down! Alex Crivier!
Crivier would make slight contact with Doohan, and in an attempt to gain speed out of the corner in order to catch up with him, would get on the gas just a little too early, losing the rear end and causing a violent high side, kicking him out of his home Grand Prix, which he had looked sure to win just a few corners prior. Fans would wait at Angel Nieto corner for Crivier to come around, but he would never arrive, and a chorus of boos could be heard as fans realized what had happened, even though they were likely the cause. Fans would go on to boo Doohan at the podium ceremony and whistle over the playing of the Australian national anthem. This may be the only race in history where a rider's own fans caused him to lose. The 1961 Swiss Grand Prix. The 1961 Swiss Grand Prix featured the culmination of the largest spying scandal in motorcycle Grand Prix racing history. This is another story I'm going to have to cut incredibly short to save time, but I highly recommend the book Stealing Speed by Matt Oxley if you'd like to hear more about it. I might end up making a full video on this at some point because it is truly one of the most fascinating stories in motorsports history, and I would like the chance to tell it in full, but for now, a short summary will have to do. The scandal revolves around the German rider Ernst Degner. Degner was born in Poland, but during World War II would be forced to leave the country, eventually ending up in East Germany at the end of the war. In 1956, after finding success in national competition, Degner would be signed to the East German factory MZ by father of the two-stroke, Walter Codden. Come the 1961 season, Degner was a serious title contender for the 125cc class on the German two-stroke, but he had larger concerns than that. He and his family had been permitted to visit West Germany for the German Grand Prix. After seeing the favorable conditions of the outside world, the Degners decided to defect from East Germany. Degner would need a contract with another factory to continue his career, so he would contact Suzuki, who were interested in getting their hands on the secrets of MZ's two-strokes at the Isle of Man in 1961. Degner would make a deal with Jimmy Matsumiya, the secrets of MZ's two-stroke, in exchange for a comfortable life and a race contract with Suzuki. Degner arranged for his family to be smuggled out of East Germany in the trunk of a car while he was racing at the 1961 Swiss Grand Prix. Prior to the race, Degner would give Suzuki all of the specifications of the MZ machine in what has been described as the most brazen case of espionage in motorsports history. Degner had spent the past year getting really close to Codden and learning everything about the machine he could, all leading up to this moment. During the race, he had the opportunity to become the world champion in the 125cc class, something he was still very interested in despite his betrayal, but his engine would fail early in the race. Degner's main rival for the title, Tom Phillips, would end up failing to do well either, so the title was still up for grabs at the final round of the season in Argentina. At this point, Degner did not return home to East Germany, instead meeting his family in West Germany. Immediately after discovering his defection, the General German Motorsports Federation would lodge a complaint with the FIM, resulting in Degner's East German racing license being revoked. Following season, Suzuki would take the inaugural 50cc title with Degner at the helm, and after that would continue to dominate with MZ's stolen specs. And eventually, the two-stroke technology pioneered by Codden would utterly dominate the sport entirely. In November of that year, Degner was called in front of the FIM to stand trial for his actions. The charges basically boiled down to breaking his contract with MZ, selling their secrets to Suzuki, intentionally destroying his engine at the Swedish Grand Prix, and failing to fulfill his obligations to the team. He was only charged on the last account, and the biggest spying scandal in MotoGP history came down to a fine of 250 Swiss francs, about $1,200 US today. The 2021 Austrian Grand Prix. Here's a race that's a lot more interesting than it was controversial. The race started under dry conditions, but less than a lap in was white flagged. The white flag in MotoGP indicates that riders are allowed to come into the pits and swap to their secondary bike, usually outfitted with wet tires, whenever they wish. The race would proceed as normal until lap 24. With 4 laps to go, the top 6 riders, Marc Marquez, Pecco Bagnaia, Jorge Martin, Fabio Quartararo, Joan Mir, and Brad Binder, riding for 5 different manufacturers, were all separated by just 0.7 seconds. Halfway through the lap, the rain would start to fall, and at the end of the lap, the leading group would come into the pits to swap bikes. Everyone except for Brad Binder, that is. Nearly half the riders on the grid would come in to swap tires, with the other half choosing to stay out for the remaining 3 laps on slicks. The leading group would rejoin over 30 seconds behind Binder, as the rain only continued to pour. The new podium race was a 4-way battle between Aleix Espargaro, Iker Lecuona, Valentino Rossi, and Luca Marini. After just 1 lap on his wet tires, Marc Marquez, now leading the group that had come into the pits, crashed out of the race. Brad Binder would hold his lead, at times looking like he was riding on a slip-and-slide instead of a racetrack. On the last lap, the rain was utterly torrential, with the riders who had stayed out slowing to a crawl while fighting for podium position. Coming up from behind, Pecco Bagnaia and Jorge Martin would steal 2nd and 3rd place, and Brad Binder would amazingly win in the downpour while on slick tires. In the post-race interview, Binder would say that it felt like he was riding on ice with no front feel and no brakes, as the rain had cooled off his carbon brakes, making them utterly ineffective. The 2018 San Marino Grand Prix. This race featured one of the most shocking moments in Moto2 history, and one of the most brazen displays of an attempt at rider sabotage that I've ever seen in my life. The incident occurred between 2 riders fighting for non-point scoring positions, Romano Fenati and Stefano Manzi. Coming into turn 14, Manzi would lose control of his bike, and end up running Fenati off the road in the process of saving it. Fenati, a known hothead, took great offense to this, and unbelievably, while going over 200 kilometers an hour down a straight, reached over and pulled Manzi's front brake lever. Thankfully, Manzi was able to recover. Initially, Fenati was issued a 2.1 second penalty, before quickly being given a black flag for irresponsible riding. He was immediately given a ban for the following 2 races. The following day, he apologized for the incident, saying, quote, "This morning, with a clear mind, I wish it had just been a bad dream. I think back to those moments. I made a disgraceful gesture. I was not a man." Regardless, it was announced that he had been dropped from the Marinelli Snipers team. With extreme regret, we have to note that his irresponsible act endangered the life of another rider, and can't be apologized for in any way. The rider, for this moment, will not participate in any more races with the Marinelli Snipers team. 1 day later, his contract to ride for the following year was terminated as well. The FIM would heed calls for a stronger punishment, revoking Fenati's racing license for the duration of the 28 season. When Manzi was asked to comment, he gave the following response. "We had a contact 2 turns before, but nothing to justify such a reaction. His gesture speaks for itself." During this ordeal, Italian consumer rights group Codicons announced that they had officially reported Fenati to Italian authorities, asking them to investigate him for attempted murder. Eventually, he would be found guilty of the charge of private violence, which is more akin to something that would be used in an average road rage incident. This unacceptable act was by far one of the most shocking things to witness in recent memory, and there's no place for it in this sport. The 2024 Austrian Grand Prix. A quick entry on the list that makes the list due to recency bias. During the 2024 Austrian Grand Prix, an incident would occur in the paddock on Saturday. During the incident, an Aprilia engineer was seen scanning the VR46 Team Desmos Adige GP23 bikes with an iPad. Ducati team principal Tardozzi confronted the man angrily, yelling at him. Aprilia had claimed that they had not sent the man and fired him immediately. Espionage is not new to the paddock, but there do seem to be unwritten rules. While many teams knowingly employ people to take discrete photos and videos of rival constructors' bikes, the idea of sending an engineer to fully scan a bike using LiDAR technology in front of everyone was a step too far in Ducati's eyes. As of right now, it seems that the incident is settled, but could this just be the tip of the iceberg in an entirely new spying scandal? Get it? Because like the video is like an iceberg video, so it's the tip of the iceberg. The 2019 Malaysian Grand Prix. This Grand Prix is not controversial because of the moments in the race itself. However, things that would come to light about this race far later would have a great impact. Italian rider Andrea Iannone was given a drug test on race day. After the final round of the season, the test was confirmed to be positive for the anabolic steroid Drostanolone. On March 31st, 2020, he was given an 18-month suspension. Iannone claimed he had no incentive to dope and that he had tested positive because he ate contaminated meat in Malaysia. I'm not a steroid expert, but can that happen? Like, can you just eat, like, contaminated meat? Because that sounds, like, super fake to me. Alright, sorry, I'm supposed to be an unbiased reporter here. His appeal was rejected, and based on an argument from the World Anti-Doping Association, the ban was extended to 4 years, and his results from the Malaysian and Valencian Grand Prix were annulled. Controversy arose when it came to light that around the same time, Australian swimmer Shania Jack came in front of the CAS with a nearly identical case and an identical argument. She, unlike Iannone, was acquitted of all charges. Sports journalists and fellow riders were quick to come out and say that the CAS seemed to give out rulings arbitrarily and based on whether or not they believe you as opposed to precedent. Iannone's teammate Aleix Espargaro would say that while he didn't know if Iannone was guilty or not, and that was only known to him, he would call the ban, quote, ridiculous and an abuse. The 1998 Catalan Grand Prix. The 1998 Catalan Grand Prix features one of the most bizarre incidents in the history of the sport. For a number of laps, 2 riders were leading the pack that were completely out of the race. This season saw Mick Doohan looking to secure his 5th consecutive championship, with his primary rival for the spot being Italian rider Max Biaggi. Biaggi led the championship by 4 points ahead of Doohan heading into Catalunya. The two were not big fans of each other at the time, and pre-race Biaggi took some shots at Doohan, calling him too old to handle the pressure. At the start of the race, there was a 3-bike pileup between Katsuaki Fujiwara, Alex Crivier, and Jean-Michel Bayle. Barros would lead the first lap, and while the cameras would cut away from exactly what happened next, race direction would later make it known. According to a report from Race Direction, Biaggi and Barros would ignore the yellow flags heading down the start-finish straight, and would jockey for position heading into turn 1, while debris was still being cleared. Barros would retain the lead on the exit of turn 3 when cameras cut back to the action, and the two would begin to pull away. By lap 16, they had a sizable gap between themselves and 3rd place, Mick Doohan, with Biaggi leading the race. At this point, Race Direction issued both of them a stop-and-go penalty. First to Biaggi, with the intention of signaling to Barros after he had come in. However, since they had gone by the board moments after it had come out, they kept Biaggi's order out for another lap. Having made no indication he had seen the order, Biaggi kept racing hard, so the board was kept out for a 3rd lap. This time, Biaggi slowed down, turned his head to look at the board, and then put his head back down and kept racing, now behind Doohan and just ahead of Tadayuki Okada. Barros was still leading the race despite also having a stop-and-go penalty, which he was completely unaware of. Having ignored the penalty 3 times, Max Biaggi was issued a black flag, immediately disqualifying him from the race. Biaggi, once again, made no indication that he had seen the penalty, and so the black flag was kept out for another lap. This time, Biaggi rode towards the marshals, indicating he had seen the order, but wasn't going to comply. Whether or not you believe that his idea was to continue riding and then hopefully appeal the result later, or he just didn't feel like obeying the order, one thing remains true. This was unlike anything we had ever seen. Finally, 6 laps after the order had come through, Barros would receive the order to complete his stop-and-go penalty, and would do so on the following lap. In the final laps of the race, Biaggi took the lead from Doohan, and held it until the checkered flag was waved. He crossed the line ahead of Doohan, who could be seen celebrating his victory behind the Italian. A truly strange sight. After the race, Biaggi said, quote, "I felt very good before the race. I was leading, and I felt like I could win. I feel like I deserved the 25 points. Biaggi's team would file an appeal after the race to have the disqualification annulled. However, it was upheld, and Biaggi would be disqualified from the race on the record." The 2022 Catalan Grand Prix. Let's head back to the 9th round of the 2022 MotoGP World Championship. At this point, Aleix Espargaro and Fabio Quartararo were seen as the favorites to win the championship, and Quartararo was the overwhelming favorite to win this race. Heading into the round, Quartararo held an 8-point lead over Espargaro. In Espargaro's home round at Catalunya, his weekend would get off to a great start. He would qualify in pole position. Both Quartararo and Espargaro avoided a dramatic crash at the start of the race, which saw Taka Nakagami's visor get ripped off by Pecco Bagnaya's rear wheel. Throughout the race, Quartararo would establish a commanding lead, while Espargaro would fight with Jorge Martin for second. He would come across the line and start the lap in second place, but would begin to slow down and slap his gas tank. The commentators were shocked, believing Espargaro had a last-minute technical problem as he held his hand up and ran off the track. Espargaro then began waving to his home crowd and even flashed a thumbs up. He thought the race was over. This mistake isn't actually as ridiculous as most fans seem to think it is. The reason why Espargaro believed the race was over was because at most circuits the lap countdown on the dash and timing tower reads as 1. At Catalunya it reads as 0. Espargaro saw this and believed he had already finished the race. As Joan Mir and Luca Marini passed him by, still going full race speed, he realized his error and rejoined the track. Looking at these images of his team, they just look sick. I couldn't imagine. Espargaro would go on to finish 5th, and Quartararo would stretch the championship lead to 21 points. The 2021 Catalan Grand Prix. Another more funny entry on the list comes from the 2021 Catalan Grand Prix. We seem to come to Catalunya a lot, don't we? During the final few laps of the race, heavy favorite to win Fabio Quartararo, who was riding in second, would start to lose time on the leader. He would nearly fall in the first turn and would end up running off the track, allowing him to be passed by Johan Zarco. It was initially believed that Quartararo was losing time due to tire wear. Soon after, it became clear that Fabio Quartararo was having some level of discomfort with his leathers. His zipper had come fully undone, causing him to ride the last lap with his leathers unzipped and no chest protector. After the race, he was issued a 3-second penalty for the shortcut in turn 1, costing him the podium. The issue here was caused due to Fabio's leathers not being properly closed at the start of the race, allowing wind to get in and causing them to unzip during the duration of the race. After the race had concluded, numerous people had questions about why the stewards had allowed him to continue racing. Casey Stoner in particular would take to Twitter, saying, "Whether or not it was Quartararo taking his zipper down on purpose, I believe it should have been a black flag." At this level, you can't be allowed to operate at 350 kilometers an hour with your leathers open. The 2021 Styrian Grand Prix. Just before Brad Binder's miraculous ride through the rain, another rider would have a moment in the limelight in Austria, although maybe not the way he wanted to. On Thursday ahead of the second weekend in Austria, it was announced that Yamaha had suspended Maverick Viñales. This came as a shock to many, not because Viñales and Yamaha had a good working relationship, but quite the opposite. Yamaha and Viñales had just announced 6 weeks earlier that they would be terminating his contract a year early after a long series of disagreements. After the announcement, it was believed the departure from the factory team would be amicable, and Viñales would continue to ride for them with high hopes for the future. In reality, it would be quite the opposite. The Styrian Grand Prix would get off to a good start for Viñales, getting a less than perfect jump off the line, but managing to get back up into P5. When a couple of laps into the race, Lorenzo Savadori would crash into the downed bike of Dani Pedrosa. Both bikes would burst into flames, causing an immediate red flag, followed by a lengthy cleanup operation. During this time, Yamaha would change the clutch and the tire. Viñales would stall his bike in the formation lap and would have to restart the race from pit lane. According to his statements after the race, it had been a fun race up until that point and the bike was running well. However, after the changes, quote, "it was a completely different story." Viñales would backmark the rest of the race and would be issued a long lap penalty. He would mysteriously finish the race in the pit lane, claiming various electronics malfunctions had occurred, causing his dash to tell him to pit. After the race, Viñales' father would come out on social media, claiming that Yamaha had intentionally sabotaged his bike during the break. However, the truth of the matter would soon emerge. Yamaha announced that according to their race telemetry data, Viñales had intentionally over-revved his engine on the final lap in an attempt to make the engine blow, and because of this, he would be suspended from the Austrian Grand Prix, effective immediately. Viñales would apologize during that weekend, but it wouldn't make a difference. It was a very big moment of frustration because the first part of the race had been perfect, and I was starting the second part of the season well again. Then it all went wrong and there was an explosion inside me that I couldn't channel properly. I apologized to Yamaha because I rode the wrong way in the last laps, so I want to apologize to everybody. In the end, the team was not interested in his apology, and they would soon announce that he would be dropped from the team, effective immediately, not giving him the chance to ride out his last contract year. The 1968 Nations Grand Prix at Monza. This story centers around two factory Yamaha riding stars in 1968, Phil Reed and Bill Ivey. While most are familiar with the 7-time world champion Phil Reed, modern fans are less likely to know about his teammate Little Bill. Bill Ivey had been finding success in the motorcycle world, finishing 7th in the Isle of Man lightweight and ultra lightweight TTs in 1963 and 65. He signed to race for the 125cc class full-time for Yamaha in 1966, and immediately came in second place in the championship. The following year, he would get his first and only Riders' Championship, and finished third in the 250cc championship as well. Becoming something of a star, especially in Britain, he was offered a stuntman role in the 1968 Bond film Thunderball. In 1968, Yamaha was very clear about what they wanted for their two stars. Phil Reed should take the 125cc championship, and Bill Ivey should take the 250. Could you imagine, being so confident that you go, not only are we going to win both championships, we're going to plan which of our riders wins each one? That's kind of nuts. Ivey would oblige, letting Reed pass in front of him in the first race of the season in order to grant him some extra points. Reed would dominate the first few rounds of the 125cc championship, and by the time there were only 2 rounds left, he was already world champion. Reed has eye on other events going on around the paddock at this time, however, and Honda had just announced they would be removing factory support for racing at the end of the season. Reed sensed that this probably meant Yamaha would be following suit, and decided that while he had the best machine under him, it was time to go for broke. During the Nations Grand Prix in Monza, Reed and Ivey were running 1 and 2. If they finished like this, they would be tied in the points. Yamaha's orders were for Reed to allow Ivey to pass and take the championship. Reed ignored the orders, putting his head down and racing as hard as he could to the end. Reed would win the race and tie Ivey for points. Normally, a tiebreaker is decided by minor results, meaning you go by who has the most wins, if there's a tie for that, most seconds, if there's a tie for that, most thirds, etc., etc. However, this year, Reed and Ivey finished with identical records, 5 wins and 2 second places each. The FIM, faced with a situation they never thought possible, would decide to take the aggregate times from all races throughout the season and add them up. In the end, Reed was declared the champion based on this metric. Yamaha and Ivey were furious. Yamaha dismissed Reed and would never give him another ride. Ivey would also never forgive Reed for the betrayal, and the two would never rekindle their friendship. Reflecting on the situation years later, Reed expressed his regret, saying, "I won a championship, but I lost a friend." The 2001 Rio de Janeiro Grand Prix. Aggregate racing. A pair of words that's enough to send a shiver down the spine of most motorsports fans today. With most motorsports having long abandoned the practice, we have to take a trip back to 2001 to find the last example of an aggregate race in MotoGP history. Interestingly enough, the final round of the 2001 Grand Prix motorcycle racing season served as more than just the conclusion to that season. For 53 years, the 500cc class has served as the highest level of motorcycle road rating competition. However, in 2001, it was announced that the premier class would change to MotoGP the following season. Just 5 laps into the final race of the 500cc era, the race would be red flagged due to weather conditions. At the time of the stoppage, Carlos Checa was just barely behind Valentino Rossi. Rossi had already secured the championship that year, and Checa was looking for his first ever win on a Yamaha machine. After the restart, Checa and Rossi would battle for the lead, and Checa would get the better of Rossi, eking out a small gap on him heading into the last few corners. It would be enough to win the race if they put the flag out now. In the very last corner, the leading pair would come up to the rear of backmarker Anthony West, who would slow Checa down just enough for Rossi to close the gap. Checa would finish ahead of Rossi, but not far enough ahead, as when the timing results came through, Rossi was declared the winner. After the race, Checa would go on the record and say, "I saw the checkered flag, and I thought I won. When I found out the results, it was the worst feeling of my life." The 1955 Dutch TT. In the 1950s, Grand Prix motorcycle racing still had a large number of privateer riders lining up on the grid alongside factory-supported riders. If these riders hoped to be competitive, they would need to visit all of the Grand Prix on the calendar. However, travel and shipping would prove costly to many of these individuals. This could be a problem, as race organizers at the time were notoriously scummy with their practices. They would often take on more entries than they had spots on the grid. Factory-supported riders were typically able to negotiate a starting spot, but sometimes privateers would pay their own travel and air freight costs to get to a race, only to be turned away. In addition, the starting and winning pay they offered to these riders was chump change compared to what the superstars earned. By the mid-1950s, the riders had had enough, and when they showed up to the 1955 Dutch TT only to find the organizers offering the same rate as last year's measly pay, They had had enough. A group of local Dutch riders who failed to qualify for the Sunday race started a petition which made its way around the pits prior to the race. The initial petition was allegedly concerning allowing these riders to start and collect their starting money, but it soon grew beyond that. As more and more privateer riders voiced their displeasure, an idea began to form. Riders felt the starting money was inadequate to begin with, and began organizing a protest. The organizing body allegedly heard of this uprising, but either took no action or could not find enough proof to do so. The 350cc race ran for just a single lap before 13 riders pulled into the pits, among them Keith Campbell, Jack Ahern, and Arthur Wheeler. As Dutch officials ran rampant trying to figure out what had happened, spectators watched what could only be described as a fake race, with the riders finishing in formation headed by Ken Kavanagh. The organizing body was alerted that the 500cc race would see a similar outcome unless they increased each rider's starting wage by 20 euros. They countered with an offer of 15 euros. However, it was all or nothing for the privateer riders. Word reached the organizers that superstar Jeff Duke had spoken with Gilera and MV Augusta, and both teams would be supporting the privateers at his behest. Just minutes before the start time, the organizers were facing a riot from fans and agreed to meet the riders' demands. The race went ahead as planned. Immediately after the race, the furious Dutch organizers filed a complaint to the FIM. After a long series of meetings, the FIM organized a final hearing on November the 24th, where they would finally settle the matter. Duke alleged at the hearing that the Dutch organizers were lying about finding out the riders' demands the day of the race, saying he had personally met with them and told them days prior. The Secretary General of the International Sporting Court urged the federations to accept the riders' apology, but they refused, and voted 7-1 to suspend any riders who had engaged in protesting action. These riders would be suspended for 6 months, and it would end up costing Jeff Duke a chance at the title the following year. The following day, the meeting concluded with the drafting of a regulation regarding the stipulation and allocation of starting funds prior to a race start, a win for the riders. For the suspended riders, many of them would be forced to retire for the following year, and Jeff Duke would never return to his pre-suspension form. 2018 British Grand Prix. Ahead of the 2018 season, staff at Silverstone announced they would be repaving the circuit prior to the Formula 1 and MotoGP races that year. Both riders and drivers who competed at the circuit had been complaining about the bumpy surface in recent years. The circuit hadn't been resurfaced in over 20 years. In May of that year, the circuit was open to testing, and British rider Cal Crutchlow told Dorna officials he thought the repaving went perfect. Not everyone agreed with him, however, as by the time Formula 1 raced on the circuit in July, the drivers were singing a very different tune. The track was almost universally hated among the F1 grid. Lewis Hamilton called it a, quote, waste of money and the worst job ever, and Carlos Sainz was quoted as saying it was the bumpiest racetrack he had ever experienced. MotoGP would arrive at the circuit just a month later, and the track was in a similar state to that described by the F1 drivers. In FP4, rain would begin to fall, and a problem became immediately apparent. The track was so bumpy that water could not properly drain from the circuit. Immediately, 4 riders crashed, including Tito Rabat, who would suffer a broken leg. The session was red flagged. The following day, the track had dried, but just before racing was set to begin, the rain fell again, and standing water was present on the track once more, unable to drain properly. Riders completed 2 sighting laps, but refused to race due to the unsafe conditions. MotoGP officials met with riders and race organizers, and they made the decision to cancel racing for all classes due to safety concerns. The first time racing for all classes had been cancelled since the 1980 Austrian Grand Prix. Fans were outraged. Between the time of the announced race start and the cancellation, they had been forced to sit in the rain for 6 hours. But to top it off, it wasn't torrential rain. It was just standard British raininess. However, the track was so bumpy that so much still water accumulated on the track, there was no way the riders could race safely. Fans immediately demanded a refund. However, Silverstone would not be able to grant it immediately, causing some drama. The FIM would strip Silverstone of their racing license, refusing to return there until the track had been resurfaced again properly. This process would occur in June of the following year, in plenty of time for MotoGP's return in August of 2019. I closed my script. How did that happen? The 1982 French Grand Prix. In 1981, riders had expressed dissatisfaction with the quality of the track, demanding that it be resurfaced and fixed before they ride again. Despite a promise from a delegate that the track would be resurfaced when the field arrived at Nogaro in 1982, They found the track in a worse state than ever. During practice, the track was so rough several riders received damage to their bikes, the most extreme example being rider Franco Uncini's frame literally snapping during a free practice session. Coupled with the fact that the facilities were increasingly unable to fit the role of the growing sport, with toilets overflowing, minimal electrical ports, and a paddock that was unable to accommodate the size of the field, leading to concerns about fire safety from riders. In addition, security was borderline incompetent at the event, with then 10-time world champion Angel Nieto being turned away at the gate because the guard didn't recognize him. These shortcomings led to riders to contact their factories, who were in support of their riders when they came to their decision. A group of the top 500cc riders met in the trailer of American Kenny Roberts, and a letter with the riders' grievances would be drafted and delivered to the organizers. The letter would receive no response. Many of the top riders would sit out of the race entirely, refusing to race under the conditions, claiming they were too dangerous and the sport needed to evolve. Franco Uncini would later make it clear to fans that all the riders had come with the intention to race, and only decided to strike after seeing the conditions they were promised they wouldn't have to face. This incident is often credited as one of the nexus points that led to the creation of the IRTA, the International Road Racing Teams Association, an organization formed to advocate for riders and improved safety conditions. The 1990 Belgian Grand Prix. The 1990 Belgian Grand Prix. Starting in 1990, the IRTA entrusted a man named Bernie Eccleston with the drafting and handling of their race organization contracts. Now, if you're a Formula One fan, you're probably familiar with Bernie Eccleston. And if you don't know who he is, here's a brief list of the controversies on his Wikipedia page. The Great Train Robbery, tax avoidance, tax fraud, bribery accusations, comments on diversity and racism, comments on the Russian-Ukraine war, remarks about a certain German mustache man, and illegal possession of a firearm. Now that you've been properly acquainted with the man in charge of the contracts for the 1990 season, let's hear about how he killed the Belgian Grand Prix forever. Over the next 2 years in this role, Eccleston was at liberty to present Grand Prix organizers with stranglehold contracts, forcing them to double ticket prices to fans. The first of these incidents was at the 1990 Belgian Grand Prix, which saw fans paying twice the entry rate as they had a week prior at the race at Assen. This led to disastrously low ticket sales, which would lead to a disastrously low promotional budget for the following year, which unfortunately led to the Spa circuit being taken off of the calendar for the 1991 season and every season to follow. The 2009 Qatar Grand Prix. Cigarettes are bad. As more and more countries began to ban traditional forms of tobacco advertising throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, tobacco companies had to get a little more creative with the way that they got their message out there to the youth of the world. And what did the kids like? Well, kids like watching things go fast. So they turned to motorsports. MotoGP was far from exempt from this, with almost every manufacturer having a tobacco company as its name sponsor at one point or another. Eventually, countries would begin banning this form of advertising as well, and companies would be forced to remove or censor their logos for races. The 2009 Qatar Grand Prix marked the final appearance of an uncensored tobacco livery on a bike, Casey Stoner and Nicky Hayden's Marlboro Ducatis. Notably, tobacco paper brand Rizla would continue to sponsor Suzuki for a number of years, being exempt from the rules due to not technically selling tobacco products. Also, the name Rizla is like insane now. Like, I just realized that. Like, that's a crazy name. They would do well today. The 1986 South African Grand Prix. The 1986 South African Grand Prix at Kyalami was a planned event that would later be abandoned due to protests about apartheid. After the 1985 season, many organizations would begin boycotting the South African Grand Prix, including Formula One and MotoGP. The country's apartheid policies at the time saw a racist regime brought down on its people, and many organizations just refused to support it. After the apartheid policies were ended in 1992, the race was reinstated. The 1961 Argentine Grand Prix. We find ourselves now with a continuation of the story of Ernst Degner and his stealing of secrets from MZ and transferring them to Suzuki. This time, instead of screwing over East Germany, the entire country would screw him over instead. The Swiss Grand Prix, where he had made his defection, was the penultimate round of the season. And if you've been paying close attention, you'll remember that him and fellow 125cc rider Tom Phillips were both in contention for the championship heading into the final round. Well, here we are. While the events surrounding Degner's defection are well known and discussed even to this day, the events of the final race of the season seem to be less talked about, and they're almost just as interesting in my opinion. See, after the events of the Swiss Grand Prix, the East German state would revoke Degner's racing license, meaning that he would have no way to compete in the 61 Argentine Grand Prix. Luckily for Degner, he knew this would happen, and had already struck a deal with West German manufacturer EMS, who provided him with a racing license and agreed to give him a bike for the final round of the season. The German Motorsport Federation told the Argentinian race organizers that Degner had no racing license. Since the organizers of the race paid the air freight cost of shipping factory teams' machinery to and from races, this delayed the shipping of Degner's EMS machine to the circuit. Degner arrived in Buenos Aires, Argentina to find that his motorcycle was nowhere to be found, and was in fact still sitting in the corner of a processing bay in the Heathrow airport. The Argentinian organizers realized their mistake and offered Degner a Bultaco machine to race on. Degner refused the bike, claiming it was so slow he'd be lucky to finish on the same lap as the Hondas he was competing against for the title. During the race weekend, Degner and future Suzuki teammate Frank Paris would be approached by members of the Yamaha factory team with an offer for dinner. Yamaha had heard about Suzuki's acquisition of Degner and MZ's secrets, and wanted in on the action. Degner declined the offer. The following day, Degner watched from the sidelines as his rival Tom Phillips took the 125cc championship. Or did he? It turned out the FIM didn't take so kindly to East Germany meddling in the affairs of one of their championships, and informed Degner and Phillips that they would need to deliberate on the results of the championship, considering having the last race stricken from the record and giving Degner the championship instead. Degner would fly home, unsure of whether or not he was the world champion. At the FIM's Congress in Paris a week later, they would uphold the results, declaring that Degner was not the world champion, and Phillips took the 125cc World Championship. So you may have noticed that some notable incidents from MotoGP history have been missing from this list. That's because I decided to put any incident that resulted in the fatality of a rider in the bottom two tiers of this iceberg, simply because some people just don't want to watch that kind of video. And I understand that. So here's your warning: from here on out, everything on this list resulted in the fatality of one or more riders. I won't be showing any footage, and I'll be censoring any photos that I feel are too graphic. However, it's not hard to go and find many of these incidents if you go looking. Most of them are available on the internet with very little trouble. With that being said, rest in peace to everyone, and let's move forward. The 2003 Japanese Grand Prix. The 2003 Japanese Grand Prix was notable for seeing the first death of the MotoGP era. On lap 2 of the race, Japanese rider and 250cc world champion Daijiro Kato would crash at 125 miles an hour, hitting the wall near the Casio Triangle chicane and being thrown back onto the racetrack near the racing line. Crucially, the race was not stopped, and instead marshals were forced to quickly move Kato off the track under a yellow flag. Kato sustained severe head, neck, and chest injuries and was rushed to the hospital, where he spent 2 weeks in a coma before succumbing to his injuries. After the crash, many questions arose about the mishandling of the incident, with many claiming MotoGP should have stopped the race to give marshals adequate time to help Kato properly, believing that the rushed moving of Kato may have worsened his neck injuries, leading to his death. An investigation conducted by the Accident Investigation Committee concluded that, quote, "When the stretcher was moved, Kato's head drooped markedly, and it cannot be denied that this might have additionally injured his neck." This race is one of the major reasons why red flags are now so common in MotoGP. If there's any debris or rider on the track, a race will immediately be red flagged now in order to give marshals and medical staff the proper time to clear off the track and attend to anyone they need to. In addition, MotoGP would never return to Suzuka after this race, citing safety issues with the circuit. After the incident, the FIM would name Kato as a MotoGP legend, and they would retire his number, 74, from the sport. The 2011 Malaysian Grand Prix. The most recent fatality in the Premier class came on October 23, 2011, at the Malaysian Grand Prix. On lap 2 of the race, up-and-coming Italian star Marco Simoncelli was battling with Alvaro Bautista for 4th place. In turn 11, Simoncelli would lose traction, and his bike would begin to slide towards the gravel traps. In most cases, when a crash like this occurs, a rider's bike will continue in the direction it was traveling when the bike lost traction, maintaining its directional momentum. But somehow, Simoncelli's tires regained traction, sending him back onto the racing line while he was stuck to the bike. Colin Edwards and Valentino Rossi, who were running behind him, were unable to react to the crash in time. Edwards and Rossi would hit the downed rider. Edwards' bike in particular hit Simoncelli in the head, causing severe trauma. Medical staff would perform CPR for 45 minutes before declaring Simoncelli dead at 4:56 p.m. Notably, Simoncelli's helmet flew off during the crash. Many were quick to blame this on Simoncelli's large head of hair, possibly meaning that the helmet was ill-fitted to his head and did not provide adequate protection. However, it was determined after the incident that Edwards' tire had hit Simoncelli's helmet with such force it snapped the chin strap and sent it flying away from the crash. The aftermath of the death of the beloved Italian rider would lead to an outpouring of support from the sports community. His home circuit in Misano would rename itself in his honor. Formula One drivers would show their support in the races following Simoncelli's death. Multiple Italian racing outfits would end up being formed in his honor, including the Moto3 and Moto-E Sich 58 squads helmed by Simoncelli's father, and eventually the VR46 Racing Academy created by Valentino Rossi. In 2014, MotoGP would name Simoncelli as a MotoGP legend, and 2 years later they would retire his number from use, saying, "Today we say to Marco's father Paolo that from now on this number belongs to the Simoncelli family. Nobody will use it unless they decide somebody can use this number." The 1972 Isle of Man TT. Throughout the 70s and 80s, as speeds became faster and technology improved, riders began to become more concerned with course safety. A number of riders had already called the Isle of Man too dangerous to be raced. The mountain course would claim the lives of riders every year, sometimes up to half a dozen. The 1970 TT was the deadliest day in Grand Prix racing history, and Barry Sheehan had famously raced there only once in 1971 before swearing it off as being just madness. 1972 was the straw that broke the camel's back. The morning race for the 125cc ultra-lightweight class would be run under extreme rain conditions, and Italian rider Gilberto Parlati would crash in the veranda section while running in the lead, dying from his injuries. The sport's biggest superstar and Parlati's best friend, Giacomo Agostini, was devastated. Having already believed the circuit was too dangerous for racing, he swore off the circuit immediately, refusing to race in the senior TT. His team eventually convinced him to race later that day. Agostini would win the TT, but on the podium would promise he would never return to the circuit again. Agostini would lead a wave of riders to boycott the then most prestigious race on the calendar. This led to many fans forming a distaste for Agostini, believing that the TT was the purest form of racing remaining on the circuit. Eventually, the FIM would relent to the riders' wishes, and the 1976 Isle of Man would be the final time the TT would be on the World Championship calendar. The 2021 Italian Grand Prix. The 2021 Italian Grand Prix at Mugello would see the latest death in Grand Prix motorcycle racing at the time of this video. In the final lap of the Moto3 Q2 session, Swiss rider Jason Dupasquier would lose control of his bike heading into Arrabbiata 2. He would be hit by his own bike, and then by Ayumu Sasaki and Jeremy Alcoba, who had been following him. Pasquier would be treated by medical staff at the track for half an hour before being airlifted to a nearby hospital, where doctors performed multiple operations in an attempt to save his life. He was declared brain dead and taken off life support the following morning. The MotoGP grid would hold a moment of silence in his honor prior to the race, and upon winning, Fabio Quartararo would stop at the site of his accident on his victory lap and point at the sky in his honor. In the wake of the incident, combined with 2 other teenage deaths in road racing events that year, the FIM would raise the age limits of all the junior series, raising the Talent Cup age limits to 13, the Moto3 Junior Series and World Supersport 300 series limits to 15, and all MotoGP classes to 18 for the following year. Dupasquier's number, 50, would be retired in the Moto3 class in his honor. The 1953 Isle of Man TT. The 1953 Isle of Man TT has the distinct dishonor of being the only race where a Premier Class champion died on the track. Leslie Graham was the first Grand Prix champion in 1949 on his AJS Porcupine. In 1952, he would switch to MV Augusta and would find success on the notoriously difficult-to-ride bike. The MV at the time was notorious for being wildly unstable at high speeds. For the 1953 season, Graham chose an Earl's fork suspension over the highly preferred telescopic forks at the time. At the very first race of the season, in the senior TT at the Isle of Man, Graham was the heavy favorite to win not just the race, but the whole championship. Tragically, he would never get the chance. At the bottom of Bray Hill, Graham's forks would get jammed in their fully compressed state, causing him to lose control on the uphill, go off track, and be killed. After his death, the MV team would withdraw from the season as a sign of respect, with many blaming the bike for the death of the British star. Friend of Graham and fellow rider Bill Lomas would blame Graham's choice in forks for his death, as opposed to the MV. Regardless of the cause, Graham's loss was a huge blow to the racing world. In his honor, the Leslie Graham Memorial Shelter was built on the Snaefell Mountain Road in 2018. The 1982 Finnish Grand Prix. More so than a single race, this signified the end of an era, as it was the last race to ever be run on a traditional road circuit in the World Championship. Imatra was a closed race circuit nestled in between Lake Vuoksi and the USSR border. The race being often held in late August meant extremely long days and short nights, giving the Grand Prix a festive atmosphere. You probably know this track from the shots of racers like Kenny Roberts or Giacomo Agostini whizzing over train tracks at full speed, with telephone poles in the background. As speeds increased and safety became more and more of a concern, riders began to dislike the idea of riding within meters of telephone poles and houses more and more, and in 1982, the premier class would refuse to race at Imatra, leaving only the smaller classes and sidecars to race. Tragically, the heavyweight riders were proven right, when in the sidecar race, the previous year's winner Jock Taylor was struck and killed by another sidecar, resulting in his death. The championship would never return to Imatra or any other closed circuit course ever again. The 1983 French Grand Prix. The issue of guardrails being present on MotoGP tracks had been an issue with riders for a long time. Armco guardrails had originally been placed around tracks as a safety precaution for Formula One. However, these exposed sharp metal barriers with wooden supporting posts proved fatal to MotoGP riders. The issue had exploded after the 1973 Nations Grand Prix at Monza, which we'll discuss at the end of this video. In 1983, the race organizers had begun to relent and remove barriers for some races, but not all. In a practice at Le Mans in 1983, Japanese rider Iwao Ishikawa would die after a collision with Italian rider Loris Reggiani. In the actual race itself, the previous year's winner, Michael Frucci, would lose control of his bike on the 10th lap of the race, and would be sent off track into one of the wooden support posts for a guardrail. He would succumb to his injuries 2 days later. Riders were quick to point out that this was exactly what they had been talking about, and the dangers of the guardrails were again responsible for Frucci's death, with future General Secretary of the IRTA likening it to planting trees on the side of the course. This tragedy was another in an ongoing series of preventable incidents that were caused by race organizers and the FIM ignoring riders' cries for safety during the 70s and 80s. The 1970 Isle of Man TT. The 1970 Isle of Man TT will be remembered in infamy as the deadliest event in motorcycle Grand Prix racing history. 6 riders would lose their lives on the mountain course over the course of the 2-week event. Riders complained throughout the event about the lack of course maintenance in an ever faster race, citing the bumpy course as a source of serious danger. The temperatures during this event rose to such high points that the tar on the roads began to melt in places, creating even more danger. The first death came in the very first open practice session. British rider Les Isles would crash his Bultaco machine at Kate's cottage. Soon after, Sealy rider Mike Collins died after crashing at the veranda on his 500cc machine. The same evening as Collins' death, a sidecar rider Dennis Blower would lose control and suffer a fatal crash as well. In the 250cc race, Santiago Herrera would lose control on a downhill left-hander and crash his Assa machine. Herrera would succumb to his injuries 2 days later, a tragedy which would cause Assa to end factory support for road racing henceforth. In the senior TT, John Weatherall and Brian Steenson would both tragically lose their lives. This event serves as a reminder that as speeds increased and safety didn't, riders were literally gambling their lives every single time they went on the track. 54 years on to the event that claimed the lives of 6 riders, it is still the deadliest day in motorcycle Grand Prix racing history. The 1973 Grand Prix of Nations at Monza. The Grand Prix of Nations at Monza in 1973 has often been called the darkest day in MotoGP history. After the death of Gilberto Parlotti in the Isle of Man the year prior, the conversation about rider safety had exploded into the mainstream. The events at Monza this year would only add fuel to the fire, as riders would begin to demand that the FIM make serious changes. Monza's moment of horror would come in the 250cc Grand Prix. In a race for second place, Harley-Davidson rider Renzo Pasolini led Yamaha's Jarno Saarinen, who many believed to be the best rider in the world at the time, and was a heavy favorite to win the 250 and 500cc World Championships that year. Turn 3 at Monza is known as Curva Grande, and the back straight has a chicane to limit the speed coming into the turn. However, at the time the chicane was much farther back, and as speeds of the machines increased, the chicane began to do less and less to limit the speeds through the corner. Sure enough, Pasolini would crash at 130 miles an hour coming through the corner, and Saarinen, unable to avoid him, would collide with his bike. Both riders would hit the guardrail on the outside of the track and bounce back into oncoming traffic. Race direction would not only let the race keep going, they would make no indication whatsoever that a crash had even occurred. No warning flags, nothing. The pack would charge through the corner, unaware of what had just happened. Riders would run over both Pasolini and Saarinen, and bikes would begin to pile up in the corner. Fuel tanks would rupture, and sparks would ignite the hay bales near the track, turning the circuit into a hellish inferno. 14 riders would crash in total, with only a few managing to walk away of their own strength. Many incurred serious injuries, and Pasolini and Saarinen had both been killed. Unbelievably, the race continued on around them, with riders weaving through the carnage for multiple laps before the track was cleared. The incident raised numerous concerns about rider safety. Many riders blamed the guardrails around the track for the incident. These rails had been placed around many tracks after Formula One drivers demanded them for their own safety. However, they had already proven fatal to MotoGP riders. Rider Rob Fitton had already had his leg amputated by one during a race, and had bled to death before medical attention could get to him. And many riders, including Giacomo Agostini, had already called for their removal. Yamaha would withdraw their team for the remainder of the year, and an investigation was launched into the cause of the incident. Many riders and fans at the time blamed Walter Villa, a 350cc rider, for the crash. Villa had rode with an oil leak in the 350cc race prior, and there was visible liquid on the track after the race. The investigation learned that the organizers had actually known of this, as the 250cc riders had come into their office and begged for the officials to clean the track. The organizers, instead of responding to their pleas, called the police to kick them out. In the end, it turned out that a seize in Pasolini's engine had caused the accident, not an oil spill. But this fact would not be revealed until 1993, 20 years after the incident, and Villa would spend most of his life being blamed by fans for the deaths of his two fellow riders. Monza would play host to the Italian Junior 500cc Championship 2 months later. Dr. Claudio Costa would urge race organizers to station an ambulance at the corner. The organizers ignored him. In another horrific crash, 3 riders lost their lives on the track, just 2 months after the MotoGP incident. The ambulance, being stationed halfway across the track, would fail to get to them in time to administer life-saving treatment. The fight between riders and race organizers for their own safety and rights has been a common theme throughout many of the older entries on this list. It was a battle that wouldn't truly end until 1992 saw the acquisition of MotoGP by Dorna, and they would form an agreement between themselves, the FIM, and the IRTA in order to properly give racers the right to control where they raced and how they raced. The horrific lack of care taken by race organizers in the 70s and 80s is seen as inexcusable by us today. But in the early days of motorsport, the potential loss of life was seen as a natural part of the sport. It seems to be part of human nature that progress can only be made after the worst tragedies have already happened. Jarno Saarinen and Renzo Pasolini made the ultimate sacrifice in May of 1973, as did many other riders who paved the way for the sport we have today. Thanks to them, and all the riders who fought for their safety, the safety of their competitors, and the friends they had lost, we fans are still able to enjoy the art of motorcycle racing, 75 years and counting. Thanks so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.